President Biden's first year in office has been marked by both big plans and nagging problems. John Dickerson considers the highs and the lows.
It is a cliche of politics that candidates campaign in poetry,
will to the best of my ability,
but govern in prose.
We lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us.
But at Joe Biden's inauguration, Amanda Gorman's poetry anticipated the rough prose to come.
We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy.
Workers were still repairing the windows in the Capitol behind her from the violent attempt to overturn the election results. The broken glass is gone now, but not the threat.
I sometimes feel like the sun has not set on January 6th, that the day continues.
Jill Lepore is a Harvard University historian.
So long as the idea that an armed insurrection against a democratically elected president being certified into office or taking office is seen as legitimate and defended as legitimate or not repudiated by so many public figures. I hate to evoke images of such violence, but it just seems to me like it's a series of buried landmines.
Through the lens of the January 6th convulsion, the Biden administration at the one-year mark is a success merely because it exists at all. Democracy held. But presidencies are viewed through many lenses, and any way you look at it, the first Biden year looks muddy. How's Joe Biden doing?
I think Joe Biden's doing okay. He ran for president on this promise of a return to normalcy, on a return to America, maybe not quite as it was before President Trump, but much less chaotic.
Jamelle Bouie is a columnist for the New York Times.
The persistence of the pandemic and the persistence of the pandemic's disruption of American society, I think, means that Biden can't really claim that this has been a victorious year. It's okay. It's eh.
This is not the chant Biden wants to hear at the next rally. 4 more meh. The bluntest story of the Biden presidency is told in his approval ratings. They started to drop last summer with America's messy departure from Afghanistan and have continued to fall while COVID cases, crime, and inflation have been rising. A presidency that started with heady comparisons to FDR now invites the headline, "It's not over for Joe Biden." But history tells us that the bluntest story is not always the lasting one, especially for presidents in their first year.
The impressions people have 1 year in very rarely have any bearing on how that president is seen at the end of a first term or a second term, how that person is seen in history.
Author James Fallows was a Carter speechwriter.
Jimmy Carter, who, as history knows, was not reelected, was extremely popular in his first year in office.
Carter's first-year approval rating was higher than Ronald Reagan's, and his party lost fewer seats in the midterm House elections than Reagan did, though Reagan is considered the more successful president. Measuring presidents in the moment is hard, says Jill Lepore, because people focus only on what's right in front of them, like a protracted global pandemic.
I'm kind of puzzling over this. How do you measure a president? What most of us are measuring day to day are the COVID case numbers.
Does that basically mean the approval rating is a general thermometer of public feeling, and if the public's unhappy, the president, as the best-known politician, is the one that gets blamed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what it is, sort of a proxy for the national mood, rather than an evaluation of the efficacy of an administration, right? And most of us don't have the ability day to day to evaluate the efficacy of the administration. In a way, with Trump, it was a little different because people did know what Trump was doing every day because he was tweeting all day long.
Being president means sitting in the national complaint window. You are the target of public anger whether you caused a problem or not. Biden's success delivering vaccines into arms was undermined by ideological hesitancy and viral variants. Those aren't his fault, but he is responsible for the mixed public health messages, and the president admitted being caught flat-footed on testing.
We're on track to roll out a website next week where you can order free tests shipped to your home.
The withdrawal from Afghanistan fits a similar pattern. Some part of public upset was the inevitable, unpleasant result of doing what the public wanted. But it's also true that the Biden team failed to account for how quickly the country would fall.
Biden made the decision to leave Afghanistan, so he can be judged up or down based on that decision. I judge him up on that because it is what his predecessors have said and what he promised when he was running. Then there's the execution. And there is room for fair commentary about whether the human cost was needlessly grave. Even if the decision to leave Afghanistan had been carried out in the most perfect possible way, it would have been a tragedy there.
On the economy, inflation in December rose 7%, a spike that hasn't been seen since 1982 during Ronald Reagan's first term, and that economists in both parties predicted would be caused by Biden's early spending programs.
I've lived through times of hyperinflation. I've lived through times of mass layoffs. And let me tell you, mass layoffs are way worse. The trauma to families and to communities and to companies is much worse than the genuine problem of inflation.
The unemployment rate is moving in a more encouraging direction, just 3.9%, down from 6.3% at the start of Biden's tenure.
This is probably the strongest economy for workers that the United States has had in some time. But Biden gets no credit for any of this.
Columnist Jamelle Bouie.
So without credit for a strong economy and with the resistance from Republicans and a Democratic Party that is feeling unenthusiastic, he's in a tough spot.
Democrats are unenthusiastic because Biden has not been able to pass the robust social spending legislation he initially proposed, or voting rights legislation. Tough to do when Democrats have the thinnest possible majority in the Senate and can only afford to lose 3 Democrats in the House. So, as you feel it, given the margins that Biden faces, has he been stymied, or is this just kind of the slow process that it takes when you have these kind of margins?
I think I'm somewhere in between the two. The infrastructure bill, depending on how you count, is either $600 billion or $1.1 trillion. And the COVID relief bill was $1.9 trillion. In a year, President Biden has signed $3 trillion for the spending into law, which is, I believe, more than his Democratic predecessor signed in his entire 8 years in office. So by that standard, Biden's doing great. But by the standard of the coalition and the coalition's expectations, and by, I think, the administration's expectations, he is probably behind.
Biden, feeling the heat from his base, signaled his urgency about voting rights.
I've been having these quiet conversations with the members of Congress for the last 2 months. I'm tired of being quiet.
Neither quiet nor loud worked. At the end of last week, Democratic Senators Manchin and Sinema wouldn't support changing Senate filibuster rules to pass voting reform.
I hope we can get this done. The honest-to-God answer is, I don't know whether we can get this done.
The same day, the Supreme Court struck down the administration's employer vaccine mandate, another setback at the end of the first year of Joe Biden's presidency, which means the second year starts not with poetry or prose, but with the blues.